Okay. Thank you very much. It's very nice to see you all. Today, I want to explore how the echoes between post-humanist thought and indigenous knowledge systems reverberate through tribal colleges, particularly drawing on the work I've been doing with Red Crow Community College in the Blood Tribe for the past 2 years. Well, probably more past 9 years or so, but that's a different story. What I'm hoping that the analysis contributes to is this ongoing conversation about decolonial approaches to knowledge production and sovereignty within Indigenous-run institutions. So knowing this would be of great interest to the post-humanism community, I'm very grateful to be here. The title Becoming Human is one of the comments that Elder Kelvin Williams Pretty Shields at the Blood Tribe, who's the chair of the Board of Governors at Red Crow, who listed becoming human as the prime objective of the college, is to help the members of the community become human. So as traditional reading, Oki da mitsitigo, happy good day. Oki nida nigo Mickey Vallee, dear to Canada Research Chair in Sound Studies at Athabasca University. Sikota hitsitipo ito kanohop. I'm very happy to be here and for the reason that we're gathered here. I live in Blackfoot Territory, Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, home of the Nitsitapi. I'm also a community partner and research advisor to Red Crow Community College in Standoff, Alberta, home of the Blood Tribe. I live in Okimistake, which is near the mountains of the Alberta, BC, Montana border, the corner of Cowboy Trail, Highway 22, and the Crow's Nest Highway, Highway 3, and also home of the Freedom Convoy. I'm going to open. I'm going to open with something that happened. Sorry, when I get nervous, I make bad jokes. Let me open with something that happened in 2015 while teaching a social problems course at the University of Lethbridge. It was during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's gathering of residential school survivor testimony. At the time when I was teaching at University of Lethbridge, I had several Blackfoot students that asked to miss the class to travel up to Edmonton to testify. And when they came back, I had cleared our agenda with the rest of the class to talk about it. I actually talked about this at one of our Deleuze conferences that Rosie Bernardi talked at, I remember. But the contrast hit pretty hard. Our usually noisy hallway went dead quiet. And, we had a dark classroom and blinds were pulled down, and most of the students had actually skipped the class on the day that we were going to be talking about the TRC, oddly enough. And it wouldn't be on the exam is what I told the other students, because students have this contractual relationship now with their syllabuses. But just a handful of Blackfoot students had shown up, and a few others of the more eager ones. And one of the Blackfoot students had said to me, well, in the rest of the class, he said that this experience of being in the darkened classroom without anyone witnessing was what they had felt they experienced in the testimony of the TRC. Their quote, I'd written it down, was that there was witness testimony, but there were no witnesses to the testimony. And that observation about the absence of real witnessing, both in my classroom and in the supposed reconciliation process, pushed me to start looking at further Indigenous ways of knowing. But just to ground this in the PRI, and it really is an honor to be back with the Posthumanism Research Institute. It was an institute that my university and myself, we had put considerable effort towards founding back in 2015, 2016. And I'd been taking a little exodus from research and scholarship in order to sort of immerse myself in this community. And I'm just sort of coming back up now to share some of these experiences. I've just been given permission by the Board of Governors a few months ago to start talking about these experiences. So I've only recently been sort of talking about this. But I had to ground it in some theory first, and just so we're all on the same page, as we agree that posthumanism continues to emerge as a challenge to human exceptionalism. It's a stubborn Western notion that humans sit at the peak of existence and that they hold exclusive rights to meaning making. These philosophical threads are running deep from A lot of people who, they visit pre-Socratic thought, like Michel Serres, and, or anyone who's always looking for the rebirth of philosophical thought, kind of return to these, pre-Socratics, or up through Derrida and Haraway and our beloved Deleuze and Guattari. These people's work, of course, they expose how taken for granted categories of binaries are not natural truths, but social constructs or assemblages that prop up power structures. And what posthumanism drives at, if we're going to paint it with a broad stroke, is that we're not above the web of life, but we're more entangled in it, right? And that resonates with what I'm seeing in my research. And these are echoes between different ways of knowing and different ways of being. There's also this rhythm between posthumanism and stumbling towards what indigenous knowledge has long understood, right? And this fluid way of being where humans pulse within nature's broader rhythms. There's scholars, of course, who, over 100 years ago, Western scholars who said that, like Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who called it a radical idea to say that entities exist only in relation to one another. But this isn't new territory for indigenous thought. And to be clear, we can't just collapse indigenous knowledge into posthumanism. That would echo the same old colonial patterns. And when indigenous peoples speak of creation stories and shape-shifting and such, they're not just stories, right? They're articulating a lived understanding of how all beings resonate with consciousness and with connection and ongoing connection, right? The end. And this isn't knowledge that you can timestamp or measure like in sort of more colonialist terms. It moves in cycles, it moves in spirals, like the echoes that run older and more profound, right? So I need to address something critical about posthumanism's limit in this indigenous context first. It's for sure, posthumanism challenges human supremacy, but it remains bound within Western philosophical structures. Consider how we discuss the Anthropocene, right? Even in critiquing human impact, we're still, as has been observed by other indigenous scholars, we're still centralizing the human narrative. We're caught in the same conceptual loop, just with a more critical kind of inflection. Indigenous thought moves through different kinds of pathways entirely, and it doesn't critique human dominance. It emerges from lived relationships, right? With land, with non-human beings, with generations past and generations coming. It's not an abstract theory. It flows through daily practice and through bodies and through time. And so when I speak of this term like ontological responsibility or ontological responsibilities, rather, I'm reaching for something that exceeds kind of the Western framework, right? It's not about theorizing our relationship with the world. It's about living it, embodying it, fully fulfilling our obligations to our relations. And in Blackfoot thought, to speak briefly on it, and these are not set definitions or so, and they're always sort of living. And but they're called. Betty Bastien had written a book on Blackfoot ways of knowing, which is a really important book for understanding the way, like the metaphysical system of the Blackfoot ontology. But it's also one that only really works when you're having it in conversation with Blackfoot elders and such who we talk to and or I've talked to quite often, and we talk about the differences. But it's a really important book if you want to get into it. It's for free as a PDF at the University of Calgary. Ontological responsibilities are central to understanding identity and community, and they're linked to ceremonial practices and a deep connection with the cosmos. And these responsibilities reflect more of a comprehensive worldview where every element of creation has a role, emphasizing an active engagement with life and not just a sort of passive existence. So in Blackfoot thought, these ideas aren't, no single concept can be defined in a silo, right? You can't contain them in academic prose, right? They're active forces animating daily life. And this is why we need to move beyond sometimes posthumanism's boundaries to kind of engage with indigenous ways of knowing. But just to break this down a little more, it's about listening. A lot of my work has always been about listening, sound, and voice. To break it down, indigenous cosmology moves through different currents than Western systems. including posthumanism. Right? Well, posthumanists try to theorize a way out of that human, non-human binaries. Blackfoot understandings already flow past these sorts of divisions, right? There's a Blackfoot term that I'm not going to try to pronounce at this time, but it means it's that which gives life. And it's not theoretical, right? It's kind of a lived reality. It's breathing through the creation stories, breathing through the spiritual practices, manifesting in daily rhythms of relationship between humans and non-humans. Time works differently too, right? Western thought, even at its most radical, still marches forward in lines. But at Red Crow, where I've been working, I witnessed how historical trauma and future healing don't follow sequence. They spiral together. They shape each moment simultaneously. And past and future pulse through every present. This kind of shift is everything. This shifts everything that we about how we approach academic expertise. And Western systems treat knowledge like something that you can own, that you can package and you can transmit. But in Indigenous thought, and Blackfoot thought in particular, knowledge lives fully in relationships, right? It's bound to the land, right? And in ways that resist extraction or abstraction. You can't pull it out of context without fundamentally changing what it is. So the question of what it is more a question of what it does, right? And that's not just a theoretical framework again. It's a direct challenge to how we think about expertise, about knowledge itself. There's also theoretical tensions. We need to confront something really critical here, right? Like there's a risk of academic extraction. And even as we theorize and analyze Indigenous knowledge systems, we risk performing the same old colonial moves. Western frameworks have this habit of absorbing everything into their own categories, stripping away context, complexity, relationship, and starting departments and faculties and such where these knowledge silos come in against the better interest of interdisciplinary frameworks like posthumanism and new materialism. The Blood Tribe know this pattern very well. Researchers who came, who collected, who vanished. I'm not sure if anyone knows this. They probably do. Is that even the foundations of psychological theory start a lot with the Blackfoot, and they're often never returned and never maintained relationships. And this is an ancient history. It's a present reality that demands different practices. And the practice still continues today of these extractivist methods on Indigenous communities, the Blackfoot community in particular, and countless that I've witnessed firsthand that I will not mention at this time. At Red Crow, I really learned what this means. I will talk later on about an 8-hour community consultation that taught me about the genuine engagement that isn't about extracting data, but is about presence. It's about staying, it's about visiting, it's about letting go of conventional academic impulses to document everything. So what happened with this is there was a kind of a silence that emerged as a methodology, not a dead silence of the classroom during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but something more active and an alive silence. And when working with the Blood Tribe on research ethics, I remember it was at the beginning especially, they didn't want me to take notes. And they didn't want me to record anything. It's really against the ethics to record something without so they wanted listening, real embodied listening, the kind that transforms the listener. It's beyond sound, it's beyond the auditory, but it demands kind of a full sort of presence. And that breaks open academic conventions about what counts as knowledge, what counts as method, and what counts as understanding. Now, the focus of this also is that we're not just talking in abstractions or about like different theoretical systems or anything. We're talking about like a system, and we're talking about an education system. And particularly, we're talking about tribal colleges. And tribal colleges are rather, I don't want to say unique to the United States, but they certainly have a more fertile kind of ground there than they seem to in Canada right now. And that's simply because of funding structures. Right? Now, tribal colleges in the United States have transformed into something very powerful, right? They are sites of Indigenous education and research sovereignty, and also community responsiveness and community responsibility, right? The numbers alone tell part of the story. 62% of tribal college research boards maintain public documentation. But the real significance runs a lot deeper, right? They're not just managing research, they're asserting a kind of control over how knowledge moves, how it's gathered, how it's used. So that's kind of rewriting the relationship between Indigenous communities and the research process itself. Through tribal colleges in the United States, they have strict kind of research ethics boards and research ethics protocols. And Indigenous peoples are taking back governance over their stories, their lands, and their resources. And just as a side note, I understand that there's some colonialist implications on governance, but we tend to use it, or they tend to use it at Red Crow. The Canadian setting moves a little differently. Instead of building out separate tribal colleges, Indigenous communities here tend to work within and against mainstream institutions. They transform research ethics and data governance from the inside out, right? So the structural difference matters. It speaks to Canada's particular colonial patterns. Yes, we have developed Indigenous programs within mainstream universities, like the University of Lethbridge has a Faculty of Native Studies, and the University of Alberta as well, UBC, University of Toronto, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, we have some Indigenous focused institutions, but this hybrid approach isn't just an accident of history. It's produced its own kinds of tensions and its own kinds of possibilities that we're witnessing happening on the rise at this particular college. And it's this that I wanted to raise attention to. Let me talk a little bit about the college first and about what they're doing. Red Crow Community College was founded as the McGeistel in 1986, and it broke ground as Canada's first tribal college, designated in 1995, as designated by the Chief and Council. The symbolism was really important, right? Because first they operated out of the old St. Mary's residential school building until about 2015, when fire took the structure. And then in 2022, a new 100,000 square foot facility rose in standoff. And it was a new building, but it was also more than that. It was kind of a transformational moment. The spaces that once tried to erase Indigenous knowledge now were becoming centers where that knowledge would flow freely, where sovereignty would take concrete form. There's one kind of example of that, and that's with the smudging ceremonies that open every meeting in every classroom and every kind of consultation. And one thing that the college has is that you're free to smudge in any room throughout the entire college. Whereas at the University of Lethbridge, last I heard anyway, you can only smudge in designated parts of the building because it would violate a fire code. So even this practice of smudging itself was really important to be able to do freely in any of the rooms anywhere in the college, and that was really important to their set of ontological commitments, right? Because it's a way of, you know, passing through the ancestors and passing through time, right, with the smoke. And that shift from residential school, though, to tribal college manifests something really profound about Indigenous resistance and renewal. And so this is actually a diagram that we had cooked up to reveal something really critical about Blackfoot knowledge systems. And what you see in this diagram, I'm not sure if it's easy for you to see, but what you see here are 11 points. And these are 11 values that the Board of Governors and the Tribal College and Council, Chief and Council rather, and the administration, particularly President Roy Weaselfat, who was involved at the college for a very long time and now has been president for some time. And he's the one that's really kind of started a lot of these initiatives. And they presented me when they asked me to consult with them to try to, they're facing a problem. And the problem was that they wanted to apply for research projects for funding from the Canadian Tri-Agency, but they weren't eligible to apply. And it turned out it was a real headache trying to get Ottawa to evaluate the applications. and just getting the applications together and in such a way that Ottawa would sort of be more flexible with how they perceive research was sort of part of the challenge. But anyway, everything bound at the college is bound by these 11 principles, and they have kind of a code of making sure that all the curriculum is taught with these principles. And as you can see, I asked if I was able to share these principles with you today. And they said that when they decided on these principles and values, they said, well, we determined these as being universal values, so we're okay with you sharing them. When they originally presented them to me, they were on a list. And we were trying to figure out a way to take that list and turn it into something that more reflected how the values are seen in relationship with each other. And as you see, like spirituality or kindness to others or respect for others, purpose for being there, to be Blackfoot, being able to take on tasks independently, being helpful to others, everything comes in pairs, everything that is given to a person to do what they want with, which is knowledge transfer. The transfer is a separate value. To transfer something to others and be aware of your environment, be observant. Each line is connected to every other value. So every value is connected to every other value. So it's really hard to talk about anything really in isolation once you're kind of working there, right? So every principle connects every other principle. It's this matrix of meaning, right? So how being helpful to others intersects with both, spirituality and purpose for being there. They're not isolated. They're practices. They inform each other. They transform each other. If you look at like the symmetry of these opposed values, if you look at the symmetry of those opposed values, see transfer something to others balances against respect for others. It's not accidental, right? The principle that everything comes in pairs isn't just stated in the diagram. It's embodied in the structure itself. So it's folded into it, right? You get it. And knowledge transfer requires respect. Respect enables knowledge transfer. Be aware of your environment, be observant, sits in dynamic tension with being able to take on tasks independently, which speaks to something about Blackfoot pedagogy, the relationship between collective awareness and individual agency. You can't separate observation from action, and you can't separate spirituality from practical purpose. To be Blackfoot anchors the lower right quadrant, as you see. It's not an identity statement, but it's a practice that emerges from all these intersecting relationships. And it suggests that being Blackfoot isn't about checking boxes of cultural traits, but about living within that reciprocal obligation and that understanding. So the circular structure itself tells us something vital about how those values work, right? There's no top and there's no bottom, really. There's no starting point, there's no end point. Each value gains meaning through its connection to all the others. And this isn't just a list of principles, it's a map of how knowledge moves, and it's an ongoing, it's a cartographic making, a process of cartographic becoming as such, So how responsibility works, how being happens. And these are the Blackfoot words. And again, these are shared with permission, okay? Now, just look at this for a second here. And I know there's sort of a weaving kind of tapestry with this as well, right? So, but what emerges also is like, is that relationship like with how like Indigenous curriculum now is being taught like through beading or weaving, right? There's a geometric pattern here that does something really interesting. It shows that these values in Blackfoot language they're not like translations, but they're original concepts that speak to universal human principles, right? The geometry is really important though. You look at spirituality sitting in relationship with the others. What I wanted to say about that is that the traditional Blackfoot knowledge works through these geometric relationships. It's something actually that Maslow had noticed when he encountered the Blackfoot teepee. And the irony is, of course, that Maslow extracted and linearized these relationships into his famous hierarchy of needs. It's a diagram that maintains the original interconnected structure. But what Maslow missed, and what this diagram tries to make visible, is how these principles work through relationships rather than rankings. There's no basic needs at the bottom building up to self-actualization. Instead, we see environmental awareness, right, in direct dialogue to purpose, or spirituality connects directly to being able to take on tasks independently. every value maintains active relationships with all the others. And keep in mind that like the Maslow's hierarchy is like a foundational understanding of psychological principles that were taken to be universal thereafter, right? But they were from a specific place, you know. Same thing, actually, those of you who are into music, ethnomusicology, a lot of its foundational principles were derived from Bruno Nettles, working with the standoff community. He was a foundational thinker in ethnomusicology. So two very substantial, you know, one subfield of a field of ethnomusicology and an entire discipline of psychology are built based on these geometric principles, right? So it's about understanding that geometric relationships carry meaning, that the circular structure, the intersecting lines, this isn't decorative, this is epistemological. It shows how knowledge moves, how values live, and how principles interact. So you imagine trying to, you know, sort this out for a grant application. It's difficult to even say the words beyond the scope of this project when you're dealing with this kind of these kinds of principles, right? But we do, they do manage to manage a kind of balance between like guardrails on knowledge and like how to sort of streamline it for transferring knowledge, and also this interconnectedness. But you're sort of holding these two worlds in balance with each other. So these relationships, they don't just map the concepts again, they transform into concrete practices through the research ethics framework. And that's what that we've been really working on for the last few years, is this ethics framework. Where mainstream institutions treat ethics as kind of a checkbox exercise in risk management, Red Crow tries to build something different, right? And they're a process that moves through those interconnected values, and they ground that research in community sovereignty. And we look at how this shifts, you know, this shifts the kind of power, right? In the ethics, for instance, it's actually those principles also, I shouldn't ignore that very important aspect, that the elders are very important for guiding those principles, right, and for upholding them. Right now, the language, the Blackfoot, is facing, it's an endangered language, right? So a lot of the work that they're trying to do at Red Crow is to secure the language and secure the way to meet the ultimate goal, which is that Red Crow becomes a fully Blackfoot immersive educational institution, like a CEGEP or like a Francophone Institute, or like a French immersion. They want it to be Blackfoot immersion, right? So elders aren't just token consultants also. They have to go through like decades of work in order to achieve the status of elder. They're paid for their expertise. They're respected as keepers of sacred knowledge. It's about building research processes that emerge from Blackfoot ways of knowing. And those are geometries of the relationships that we just looked at. Now, something fundamental is also shifted in Indigenous research ethics. You know, in a way, it's gone from protection, like the TCPS Chapter 9, which is undergoing revision, now going more towards research sovereignty and the particularities of individual communities. No two Indigenous communities can be superimposed on top of one another, let alone different communities within the Blackfoot Confederacy. It's not easy to transfer from one knowledge community to another, but they have knowledge transfer ceremonies, of course, that keep them bound to each other in partnerships, right? So Red Crow, and a lot of the work that we were trying to do at first through Red Crow was about advertising to universities on Treaty 7 territory, that if they did want to do research on Blackfoot territory, that Red Crow Community College was designated as the official post-secondary institution of the Blood Tribe, and by extension, as one of the partners in the Blackfoot Confederacy, and that there were actual research ethics protocols, which was what we had to do next, was design those research ethics when we were proposing. Well, anyway, when letting outside researchers know that there's a way to do research that's in accordance with not just TCPS Chapter 9, but the Blackfoot ethics as well. So the community is not just consulted; the community becomes the investigator. Any researcher that comes into the community has to assume that the community will be doing the research, that as soon as the research is out of the researcher's hands, which is what they have to do, the research takes on a life of its own within the community, right? So that transforms everything about how the research happens. The questions change, the methods change, the purpose changes, right? So when elders step into their role as knowledge authorities, it breaks open academic hierarchies. At Red Crow, elders are taken as having more, if not the same, credentials as someone with a PhD. They're experts. They're not general practitioners. They're experts in their field, and they will always defer to one another when you go to an elder to ask about agriculture or ranching, or to ask about the history of the the legalities of Treaty 7, or leadership, or war, or anything like that. They defer to one another as experts in their field, or genealogy and such, right? So they study for decades in order to get this accreditation, essentially, for lack of a better word. Their wisdom does carry the same weight as a PhD. So, it does change the way that elders are perceived as well. Whereas, like a lot of universities on Treaty 7 territory, maybe the practice is changing, but elders on Treaty 7 territory were often compensated with like the usual compensation, as if they were just informants to inform a thesis produced by a mainstream university. But now they're being considered holding the same weight as an expert. So the financial compensation at Red Crow for an elder is more substantial and appropriate. So Blackfoot values don't just frame the research, they drive the research. Every proposal has to show how it advances the knowledge system. Research is not about producing papers, which is why I've been on a research outputs hiatus for the last few years. It's about strengthening the cultural continuity and serving community needs, and we're moving through these principles in very concrete ways, right? Everything at Red Crow moves through the Nitsatsapi, which is the real people and the Blackfoot way of life. And it isn't about researchers studying Blackfoot culture. Each proposal must show how it strengthens and preserves and advances Blackfoot knowledge systems. How does it serve the language? How does it build cultural continuity? And the main thing is how does it serve the community? That's the main question that the ethics board asks anyone coming into the community. How will your research help the community? And it turns out that's a very difficult question to answer, but it was a very easy question to come to, interestingly enough. The data sovereignty then isn't really an afterthought, it's foundational. So Red Crow now, now that they have research eligibility status with the tri-agency, data sovereignty is foundational. The community owns its stories, it controls how findings move, it protects its intellectual property, right? That old pattern of researchers extracting knowledge and then disappearing, that stops at Red Crow. So the community benefits from the research, and that benefit drives everything, not just academic papers or conference presentations, but the real material outcomes, training programs, jobs, direct community development, soccer coaches. If it doesn't serve the people, it doesn't happen. So that framework demands relational accountability. Researchers can't maintain that artificial academic distance. They have to build real relationships with the community through the college. And that's what they're hoping anyway. And this doesn't go without its contestations. It's not that this is like a smooth transition, right? So they have to build real relationships with participants, with elders in the land itself, to stay present, take responsibility, and always return to the community, right? The research center, I forgot to write, I'm sorry, that's actually not the name of the research center. The research center is actually called the McGoxkin Center for Blackfoot Research and Resilience. And it grew from that kind of resistance, from memories of researchers came, took knowledge, and vanished. It guards knowledge sovereignty. It transforms how research happens on the blood tribe. So data doesn't belong to universities anymore. It belongs to this particular college, or the principal investigators in the college. And now the college itself can put forward research applications through the NSERC and through CCI, that's the Canadian Community Innovation. I'm sorry, I forget the sub entity that is. But through NSERC and SHRC and such, we put forward some grant applications through SHRC and such. So we'll see how this works, right? So this isn't about just releasing forms, it's about fundamental ownership of community stories, right? And cultural protocols shape that whole research process, right? You can't just slot ceremony into a timeline or treat seasons as scheduling issues. right? Research has to move with ceremonial rhythms, has to align with community cycles, it has to respect the pace of the Blackfoot way of knowing, right? So when it comes to sacred knowledge, specific mechanisms determine the kinds of boundaries, like what can travel beyond the community, what needs to stay close. There even had to be, they've had to put out scouts to rein in researchers who are sharing images that weren't shared with permission, right? So elders decide, and it's usually elders that make the decision. They are the first person to go to and the last person to consult as well. They hold the authority to protect culturally sensitive information, to maintain those essential boundaries, right? We talked earlier about open data sharing, and like, you know, as much as like we celebrate open data, there's a really important concept here, which is closed data, right? And to have protected data as well. And that's part of having data sovereignty. So data transparency is really important, but so is a data shield, right? It's really interesting for those who are interested in post-humanist data studies. So external researchers have to transform how they think about knowledge. They need to understand how Blackfoot protocols work, how knowledge moves through community relationships, how responsibility operates. And community consultation follows these precise patterns that we developed, right? There's not a town hall and then check a box and you move on. The process demands a very structured engagement across community sectors. So you have to have these long consultations, these very time demanding stakes here, and the community shapes that research, right? So elder involvement, they need to be involved every step of the way, and there's an ongoing evaluation and adaptation in the process itself, right? So just kind of to start with the story and put it on record, it started when Red Crow had been trying for years to gain research eligibility status with the Canadian Tri-Agency. You had to submit we had to submit, sorry, 3 separate applications, right? We had to submit one to the Social Science Humanities Research Council, of course, to SSHRC. We had to submit one to CIHR, Canadian Institutes for Health Research. We had to submit one to the National Science and Engineering and Research Council. And each application required different projections and documentation, like financial projections and strategic direction plans, institutional histories, proof of research capacity. My God, this was the most fascinating field exercise for me, learning about research administration. I feel very lucky sometimes that this was my exposure to research administration, and I feel very grateful for that. Even after gaining eligibility, the grant rejections that soon followed revealed a deeper problem with how research is evaluated, right? Ottawa was saying, give us accurate representations to an international audience. And Red Crow was saying, how will this help our community? It was 2 separate conversations that were happening about the same topic. And that itself was a very, sometimes a very confusing mess. And I had to become bilingual between Blackfoot and Ottawa, or I called it hot air language and Blackfoot language. So the community conducts research collectively, implements solutions through curriculum, focuses on direct community benefit, that kind of stuff, right? So even after gaining eligibility, we had to still negotiate with Ottawa about how to get our research funded. And so as a telling detail of where, you know, what happened, I don't know if I put the story here in this, but oh yeah. So the story is that we put forward an application and twice it was rejected. And the problem is, it turns out, with the people on the other end were sort of admitting that the adjudication process itself was something that needed to be more particular to local communities and needed to change, that you can't just have you know, certain people that work in Indigenous studies departments sort of like across the board evaluating these different Indigenous applications. You had to have something that was very specific to these particular knowledge systems. As much as I talked about Indigenous cosmologies before, there's a difference between that general and the local, right? So oh, what was that one? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. So years had passed. That's kind of where we are now. That's like the administrative stuff. But just to sort of take us back to where I started, if you recall how I started the presentation, years had passed and I tried researching Indigenous art afterwards and testimony, but I learned the hard way about extractive research practices. After having a Shuriken Insight grant rejected based on the fact that I didn't have enough community consults, I kind of put the whole research into hibernation. I shifted to other kinds of work. I ended up working on this candidate research chair with bioacoustics. But that early experience, this kept pulling at me. Then in 2022, I was put in touch with the president of the college because I maintained contact with them. And he saw that I was gaining more and more research experience as a CRC, and he wanted me to help establish their research center. So I thought it'd be really straightforward. I thought I'd draft some simple documents and submit the application, and I thought it'd be really simple like that, but I was wrong. When I presented my first draft of the research ethics, the college pushed back. And this wasn't really about adapting Western protocols. They said they wanted something that emerged from Blackfoot ways of knowing. So they arranged a huge consultation. Well, for me anyway, it was 8 hours. It was 30 to 40 Blood Tribe members circled around me in a room. It was a circle around me. And it wasn't formal. Like the circle wasn't really necessarily formal, but I just ended up being directed to the center of this room, and everyone was just around. There's lots of, there's lots of sandwiches, and like it was catered. It was like a really partly leisurely, but it was to really say like, you're going to be here a long time. And they shared stories about residential schools, about community needs, and they just sort of spoke openly to the air, not like looking directly at me sometimes, and then just sort of like, we sort of talked collectively. But, my Western instincts kicked in, and I started taking notes. But I noticed that people, in the room were becoming a little, or like the air got a little drier in the room when I started writing things down. So I kind of slipped my notebook away and just sort of listened. And through those hours of stories, something really shifted. And I started to understand how knowledge moves differently in that situation. It didn't move in straight lines, but it moved again in circles, right? And I got to get back to my notes here, sorry. But it moved around in circles, right? Yeah, it wasn't like something that you could extract and write down, but it was something that lives in relationships and stories and the spaces between people. This wasn't just another meeting. It transformed how I understood the research itself, right? That consultation to learn about what Blackfoot research means, doing the research of research, it wasn't about gathering information. Ironically, to learn about the research, I couldn't extract or do any of the research in the way that I've been accustomed to doing research. So I fell into a silence. I fell into a silence with research production, with research outputs, started lovingly calling the Canada Research Chair the Canada Research Outputs Chair. And it was about, instead what I was doing was I was trying to build a relationship. And I didn't want to be scrambling away on my laptop pushing out another paragraph that says the purpose of this paper is to, right? So I wanted to find some understanding and knowledge about something circular, something spiral, something more alive. So that 8-hour consultation at Red Crow turned into what still is a pretty long-lasting relationship now. And when they insisted that we listen without taking notes, that everyone listens to each other, they weren't just changing methods, they were demanding a kind of a shift in how knowledge moves through different entities, right? Like that earlier Whiteheadian comment. Think about conventional research. We have an observer, they stand apart, they take notes, they extract data, but the Blackfoot way of knowing works through and within those relationships, through presence, through letting knowledge move through bodies, through people. You can't just write it down and walk away. And this hits at something about the methodology. When Red Crow's policies prioritize relationship over documentation, they're protecting cultural knowledge. They're transforming what knowledge is. Knowledge is something that captures you. It changes you. It makes you different, right? So that plays out concretely in just how the college structures research. Protocols aren't just checkboxes, right? They build real relationships with elders, with ceremony, with community. And when researchers have to maintain those relationships over time, when they have to let themselves be changed by what they learn, that dynamic of research starts to change too. So adding these Indigenous perspectives are really important because it moves through the different relationships. It's about moving through those relationships and maintaining them and ensuring that whatever research product that you have at the end of it maintains those relationships. So if you see those lines there, as long as they're intact, and it's almost like when you go to check, say if you want to check the timing belt on your engine or something in your car, or you want to, maintain some appliance you have around the house or something like that. When you walk away from it after having used it and having after understood it, you got to check to see if the tension is still there, that what you used it for maintained its integrity, that the research went back into that web and strengthened it. So does your research strengthen that web knowledge, right? So, there's different kinds of knowers, right? So there's a research framework for sure, right? What we're kind of hoping with this is that it becomes a model for not just for protection, but for, data sovereignty as well, or that it joins the other models that are currently in operation, right? I'm not an expert in the tribal colleges system itself. It's something that I've learned through just partnering with them and sort of helping with these projects. But it's a role in decolonial education, right? And it's also a community-led initiative, right? To revisit that original quote, and another one is that our objective is to become human, which Calvin Williams, Matsav Satan, Pretty Shields. Sorry, Calvin, if you hear that. What Calvin Williams Pretty Shields describes as our objective is to become human. I'm really happy to be back at Brock University. It's been too long. So I'll take questions. And just for my contact information, my name again is Mickey Vallee. My Blackfoot name was bestowed on me in October of 2023 at a naming ceremony, because I know proof is really important right now for these sorts of things. But my Blackfoot name is Kima Pepe Tsitsini, which is the Blackfoot name that they gave me for kind man. I'm Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Canada Research Chair in Sound Studies. I would not be able to do this research today if it were not for the Canada Research Chairs program, which I thank you very much for letting me present. I went a little over time than I projected, but I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to get back on the life size. One thing I hope is, there we go, I'm not done sharing my screen. I hope my microphone was on.
Yeah, we get here. So thanks again very much for that wonderful presentation. The way we can do this, we have about almost 20 minutes. And the way we can do this is I'll read some questions out as they come in the chat function on the website. But while we're waiting for that to start, I really enjoyed the presentation. And the one main thing I kept wondering about as you went on, especially towards the end, was what kind of impact it's had on other universities in terms of their REB process. And if you've had any impact on SSHRC. You've mentioned the frustration you've had regarding how they do assessments of grant applications. So it sounds like you may have some ongoing conversations there, especially as CRC. And is SSHRC at all receptive to modifying their criteria in terms of either in general how they evaluate grant applications, or those?
Yeah, they're doing really good. I'm actually the SSHRC representative, the SSHRC leader for my university as well, so I kind of have my ear to the street on this stuff. And they are in the process of revising the TCPS Chapter 9, and I think a lot of it is to make the policy less about generalizing Indigenous experience and more about the particularities of the communities that people come from, because it's the community that gives people the identity, right? That strengthens their identity, their individual identity. They identify as Indigenous, of course, the people I work with. But they identify primarily as from the blood tribe, right? Or from Pagani, or from a clan. Like there are different, the clan system there is it's a very complex clan system, and they kind of overlap between the different communities. But the question they always have is the question of where you're from. So even just remarking on geographic like observations, there's always sort of pointing out, I went by St. Mary's River today and the fish looked like they were jumping. And, the conversation always starts with that about who lives near the fish river and stuff. So it's always about location, right? And I guess like so yes, they are receptive. And in regards to the adjudication process, right now, we're just talking more to NSERC than we are talking to SSHRC, because NSERC has a subset of grants that are for colleges in particular. And when the grant was evaluated from Red Crow, it was deemed problematic by the adjudicators because they didn't consider curriculum development to be a research output. I know it's a little different now for SSHRC and such. They're actually more advanced than that. But that was sort of a surprise, because it's curriculum development that goes into the school that preserves the knowledge, that secures that web that I was talking about before. So SSHRC, we just submitted a grant to SSHRC, and we'll see what they say. And we're just sort of like taking it step by step to see how they read the grant applications, because the grant applications are really, we're trying to use conventional language and conventional ways of measuring, of course, but the way we talk about the focus of a research project, it really goes all over the place. So when we talk about leadership, we talk there. Every subject in that web comes up at some point, and you do find yourself in the thicket of it going, what were we talking about again? So, we'll see what the adjudicators say, because we wanted to respect that, right? So whether that will go into policy changes, we're not really sure. But they also did notice, it would be useful to have seats on any adjudication committee. Anyway, the other question that I had was, are other research departments being influenced by the research that's being done at Red Crow? Well, there's a really interesting tension that's happening there right now, because as much as research departments are open to learning from Red Crow, the latter are more hesitant to share than to the former. And that's because there are countless examples that I have from personally observing from my experience, which is I've been given permission to speak from my experience. And in my experience, there are still these extractivist research kind of ideas percolating in those institutions, albeit mostly unknowingly, because it has been often to shock and surprise of the people that we've had to talk to about their ethics and their research protocols and their policies and such. And so we're kind of prying open the door to the conversation. Like now, Red Crow Community College, sorry, it's such a long answer, but now Red Crow Community College has its own research web page. Now that we have on there a link to a PDF. It's like a 20-page PDF document that is a research ethics application form. And once we solidified the partnership with all the departments of the Blood Tribe, anyone who goes into any of those departments, of course, what you have to, if you want to access the community, they're going to know that Red Crow is there with that PDF saying, if you want to do research in the community, you have to pass by Red Crow standards. And that's something that every university and college on Treaty 7 also have to know, that you have to engage with the college in order to even talk about this stuff. So we're dealing with one application right now, and that is so far they're almost done the application, but it's taken them, I think, 6 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks so far to still work on it. They're working on it quite steadily. So sorry, Trevor, to answer the question, it's in process. Yeah, it's very new. It's all very new. To us, it's new. Maybe to other people it's not, but to us it's new. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. I'm going to go to some questions that have been written in the chat. We have 10 minutes left and we have 2 questions. So let's make sure we have at least 2 questions. Let's make sure we have time to find them. Since we talk about Indigenous ontology or ontologies, are Indigenous ontologies simply alternative interpretations of a single reality, or do they represent fundamentally different kinds of reality?
Well, isn't that an old question? That's a great question, though. And that's what I like about it, is because it returns us to these sort of like primordial things. My personal perspective is that I can't speak to what the Blackfoot ontology is, because I'm outside of that framework of understanding. it's at that point that I'd be reproducing the same sort of thing. If I understand the ontological commitments is what, okay, so here, let's talk about the ontological commitments. The idea of ontological responsibilities, and it was my mistake actually for not alluding to this in the slideshows, but they were written by a scholar named Betty Bastier, and her position was that when she went to publish the book, which is called Blackfoot Ways of Knowing, the ontological responsibilities were about, well, she knew that there'd be some heavy contestation from within the community itself. So when she went to publish the book, it was very hard to publish. People weren't really, people were slow to take up on it. But University of Calgary eventually did it with the guidance of Fritz Pannekoek, who's the old president of Athabasca University and the president of the library at the University of Calgary. And when he published it, he knew that it would be an ongoing conversation within the community itself. But just to answer your question, I can't really answer to the specificity of that. It would be inappropriate of me to do so. But thank you though. I'm of course always interested in that question.
Okay, there may be follow-ups to that, but let's make sure we get the next. Can you talk about how knowledge built through this research process?
Sorry, I forgot. I totally forgot that.
It's Long Vu.
Oh.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, I should have said the name. And this next question is from Jill Planch. Can you talk about how knowledge built through this research process gets transferred to the mainstream without falling into the extractive trap?
Oh, I was so excited to hear that it was Jill that I forgot to listen to the question. What was the question again?
Okay, no problem. Can you talk about how knowledge built through this research process gets transferred into the mainstream without falling into the extractive trap?
Yeah, I don't know. That's why I've been quiet for the last 2 years, Jill. I really don't know. The only thing that I can say that has worked, I can kind of say what's worked so far, is that, you know, knowing that there's going to be a difference between what's on the output side and where it came from, and knowing also that there's sort of a parasitical relationship there, right? That when I attach myself to the mainstream research outputs apparatus, that something is going to be lost in that transfer, right? Something's going to be omitted. So what I just have to do is I have to go and talk to, there's one main elder that I talk to, who's Calvin. And then there's about 8 other esteemed, they're called like esteemed elders, and they're like main researchers. And you just always keep that relationship and those doors open. So anytime I'm going to mention something about Blackfoot, or anytime I'm going to present on something about Blackfoot, I usually have the president's text on my phone, and I usually just mention I'm going to be presenting soon. If we have a conversation, what he feels like talking about that day is usually either permission or not. And sometimes I find out afterwards I shouldn't have shared something, or I shouldn't have done something, or I overstepped my boundaries. But it really is like, there's a really good article in I forget what journal it is. Oh, I know. Progress in Environmental Geography, and it's called Humility, Listen, and something or other. But it's about listening and respect. That's it. And it's about taking that position where you know that there's sometimes when you share things that are going to be appropriate, and sometimes you're going to share things that aren't. And it's sort of like rolling with the punches. And the way I learned about it is to just accept that you just try to avoid doing it. And as long as you grow from it, and as long as you kind of like, you know, make the right kind of amends, which is just to show humility for it, that's how you roll on. So, and so there's no guarantee that, like, if I do take things outside, and like I'm going to be starting to think about publishing stuff soon because I do kind of miss writing. But there's a very openness with the idea that these knowledge systems are compatible with Western European systems. There's an openness to that kind of idea when I talk about it. Anyway, as long as I'm talking about things like process and becoming and flow and interconnectedness like that, and especially like even very European white-sounding scholars like Alfred North Whitehead, you know, I brought his ideas in classrooms before, talking with students, and it's not about like just isolating this pocket of knowledge over here and isolating it over there, because a lot of the goal for the college and for Indigenous education in that particular moment is, yes, it's about preserving your spiritual value, right? Just like in John Locke and David Hume, that kind of idea of like education is to like build a whole person, right? To build a good subject, to build a good citizen. That's part of it too. But to do that, you know, we've got like, there's a whole economy in the Blood Tribe, right? And it's agriculture, it's livestock, it's tomatoes, you know, it's honey, right? And they want to partner with business institutions. Agriculture is like the main economic production there. And so right now we're in conversation with Tabor, Alberta, which is where a lot of like the potato farms are from. And we're starting a joint school between Red Crow and this called the, I forget what, Calare Institute, which is a farm school. It's going to be the first farm school in Southern Alberta. Oh, all of Alberta, actually. The first farm school in all of Alberta that's going to teach people hands-on training to reduce accidents in the future. So they want people from the Blood Tribe to be educated in the Blood Tribe, but they want them to have the option to move anywhere, right? So in doing so, same thing with the research output. They want people to know, but they want to be the ones who determine what gets shared, because that's traditionally the way it's been. The elders determine what gets shared. Otherwise, it's put into something sacred that only certain people can see. So, yeah. Thanks, Jill. Good to see you.
Good, thanks. We have one more written if you're up for it. Should researchers' goal be to make Indigenous realities commensurable with mainstream views for a perceived greater good? Or does an approach risk erasing Indigenous perspectives and imposing a potential uniformity? I can read that one again if you want me to.
Yeah, I can't, I love what you're saying, but I can't hear the question in it. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Should researchers' goal be to make Indigenous realities commensurable with mainstream views for a perceived greater good? Or does such an approach risk erasing Indigenous perspectives, imposing a potential uniformity?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would defer to someone who can speak to that. I can't really. Oh, sorry. Do you mind sharing the name again, Trevor? I just like knowing I'm responding to a person.
Okay, that was also long too, but I know there's a group of students that are together, and so there may be multiple students there.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. I can't speak to that personally. I know that they're and they're colleagues and friends of mine, and I know that they're very nervous about extractivist methods, and they do have tactics to prevent people from doing that. But going from like the tribal situation, like the community, to a mainstream, again, as long as you keep up that system of communication between the mainstream and the community itself, then I think preservation is going to be inevitable, right? But as long as you think about how does this research output serve the community, and that becomes the focal question, and not what journal is this being published in and who's going to read it. It serves the community first. So it's like that. I really appreciate the question earlier. I feel like I can answer it now. It's like that. No, I just lost it. It's like that ontological orientation. You have to put the community first. You are not a researcher. The research doesn't belong to you. It never did. The questions don't belong to you. So the questions belong to that conversation. They emerge from the relationships. They emerge from the situation. They emerge from the particularity, and they should always go back to that particularity, right? So sometimes research outputs have been, for me lately, they've been things like doing curriculum design for that farm school, or doing things that help the community itself, right? Or trying to find, I haven't done this, but it was one of the examples. They were wondering where they could find a soccer coach. And, you know, sometimes you're kind of like, your research output tends to be those sort of missions. It's only lately that I've kind of brought up the idea that I'm getting kind of itchy to write again. So I was hoping that I could write about the experiences, right? But so we are trying that. So I can't tell what a researcher's goal should be. And I admire that too. Is like, I think we are all looking for an answer. But, you know, we just came up with the question recently, and most people can't even answer that question. And you have to be able to answer that question, right? And if you're students, this is part of the learning process, right? Is how will my research help your community? And often, I mean, it's surprising sometimes because the answer to that sometimes seems to be, it really, and this is like the most interesting thing I found too, is that the answer tends to be, we want to have a more accurate representation of your community at the Canadian Museum of War or something like that, right? And sorry, I won't answer that. Shoot. Sorry, I can't talk now. But so like if you're you know, shit, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so your eventual research output has to think of the community first. That's all I was trying to say. I may have lost my train of thought with that, my mistake. Thank you again for the student questions. I didn't realize that was a student room. It's very good to talk to students. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for your talk today. It's given me a lot to think about, and timing is good. I've been for about 8 weeks working on a short grant application until yesterday, so I need to rethink short results. So thank you again very much. There was a fascinating talk, and if you're willing, we can talk again about future programs in the future.
Like you cut out right when you're about to say the interesting part. Hang on.
I'm not sure where exactly I cut out, but
yeah,
it was a fascinating talk. Yeah, so thanks again.
In the future or something like that.
Yeah, in the future we can.
Okay.
Okay, thanks again.